They told you the harem was a paradise. Golden walls, silken beds, perfumes that clung to the air like the breath of angels. But they never told you about the smell beneath the jasmine, the smell of fear. They never told you that once a woman crossed those jeweled gates, her body ceased to belong to herself. She became an instrument, a commodity, a weapon of empire. The harem was not a garden of pleasure. It was a prison of flesh, a psychological experiment in absolute control. And tonight, I will tell you the secrets buried inside those chambers, secrets so disturbing that history tried to bury them under silk and myth. You see, the emperors did not create harems for pleasure alone. They created them as laboratories of obedience. Every ritual, every act of intimacy, every bizarre sexual custom was designed to serve one purpose: power. Power over the women. Power over the empire. And power over history itself. Imagine being taken from your home at 15, stripped naked before strangers who measured your body as if you were livestock, poking and prodding, recording every detail in scrolls that would outlive you. Your teeth examined like a horse, your flexibility tested like a piece of furniture. Not because they cared for your comfort, but because they were assessing your worth as an object, not a human being. And if you passed their tests, that was only the beginning. Because the real horror was not selection, it was transformation. Women were trained to suppress their emotions, to silence their individuality, to erase themselves until nothing remained but a smiling mask. The empire wanted bodies that obeyed without hesitation, beauty without rebellion, desire without choice. The most bizarre sexual practices of the harem were not random acts of decadence. They were systems of control disguised as pleasure. Goats used to select partners, eunuchs keeping records of every encounter like accountants of the flesh, women trading their nights with the emperor as if their very souls were currency. Behind the curtains of silk and shadow, sex was no longer intimacy, it was bureaucracy, warfare, politics, and psychological torture all fused into one. And here is the truth they never wanted you to know: the harem was not about women at all. It was about the emperor's grip on reality. By controlling desire, he controlled loyalty. By controlling loyalty, he controlled the empire. And by controlling the empire, he controlled history itself. Now, listen carefully, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Every chamber, every ritual, every practice was a mirror of the empire's corruption. And if you dare to descend with me, you will never look at power, or at intimacy, the same way again. Picture it, a courtyard filled with trembling young girls, their eyes wide as soldiers bark orders, their hands clutching each other until their knuckles turn white. They've been dragged from villages, torn from families, marched into the belly of the palace where their fate is no longer their own. They don't know it yet, but they've entered a machine, a system of selection so dehumanizing it reduced the human spirit into numbers, measurements, and silent obedience. The process was called Xian Nu, selection of beauties. But it was not beauty they were searching for. It was compliance. The first stage was physical inspection. Imagine being stripped in front of strangers, your body catalogued like a ledger entry. Officials ran their hands along skin, tested bone structure, and even forced open mouths to inspect teeth. A crooked tooth could end your life's chance at survival. But beauty alone meant nothing. What mattered was control. Next came the trials of silence. Hours of standing without movement. Hours of being watched while you ate, your posture dissected, your every gesture recorded by scribes who wrote not in words of praise but in cold judgments, too opinionated. Too restless. Too alive. The women who passed were not those with spark or spirit, but those who could erase themselves, who could exist as shadows, perfect masks with no flicker of rebellion. And then, the psychological rituals began. Night after night, girls were tested in obedience drills. They were told to kneel in painful positions, sometimes for an entire night, just to see who would cry first. They were denied food, then given feasts, then starved again. Why? Because the system wanted women who were malleable, broken, conditioned to see pain as normal and pleasure as something granted by the emperor's whim. This was the first secret of the harem. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about engineering loyalty. These bizarre sexual practices, later praised as exotic, were never truly about desire. They were about teaching women that their bodies were not their own, that every touch, every breath, every intimate act was property of the empire. Understand this: the harem was a theater. Every ritual, every position, every order served the emperor's psychological dominance. A concubine's value wasn't just in beauty or skill, it was in how perfectly she embodied the illusion of devotion. The best were not the most radiant, but the most obedient. And that is the horror: the system worked. By turning women into living statues, the empire built a sexual machine that fueled politics, silenced rebellion, and transformed intimacy into the most powerful weapon of control. But the descent doesn't stop here. The next chamber reveals how sex itself was ritualized, documented, scheduled, and stripped of its humanity until it became something even more disturbing: the bureaucracy of desire. Now imagine this: the emperor does not slip quietly into the night, choosing lovers on a whim. No. His intimacy is orchestrated like a military campaign, catalogued like taxes, and scheduled with the precision of astronomy. Sex in the Imperial Harem was not passion, it was procedure. Every encounter was recorded in what scholars later called the bedchamber registers. Eunuchs, castrated men sworn to silence, acted as scribes of desire. They kept ledgers that listed the exact date, time, and name of each concubine who entered the emperor's bed. Sometimes, even the length of the encounter was noted, alongside cryptic symbols that suggested the emperor's satisfaction or disappointment. This was not romance. It was surveillance. The ritual began with a bizarre practice that has left historians speechless. A concubine, stripped naked, was rolled into the emperor's chamber wrapped in a silk sheet, like a parcel delivered to a king. Why? Because physical contact before official approval was forbidden. The eunuchs would lift the bundle, carry it to the emperor's bed, and only then would she be unwrapped, an offering of flesh, sanctioned by the bureaucracy. But the cruelty didn't end with procedure. To prevent jealousy from spiraling into chaos, every concubine's night with the emperor was determined by strict rotation. A wooden tablet engraved with her name was placed in a tray, and the emperor would flip through them like a gambler handling cards. Once chosen, her tablet was moved to a special register, her body scheduled for service. Desire was no longer a choice, it was a logistical operation. And here is the most chilling part: these records weren't kept for passion, but for politics. A concubine who bore a son could shift dynasties, tilt the empire's future. So eunuchs documented everything, ensuring that when a child was born, there was an official trail proving whose womb had carried imperial seed. Sex was no longer intimacy. It was a bureaucratic weapon, a mechanism to preserve bloodlines and prevent challenges to power. Now pause and see it clearly. What modern men call romance, spontaneity, freedom, intimacy, was, in the harem, replaced by documentation, ritual, and control. The emperor did not need love. He needed certainty. He needed women transformed into data, wombs turned into ledgers, intimacy turned into empire. And this truth should unsettle you: when passion is reduced to record-keeping, human beings become entries in a system. Not lovers. Not partners. Not even people. Just names, dates, bodies, filed away in the archives of control. But the descent doesn't stop here. The next chamber of this story reveals how sex became a battlefield, where women fought each other in silent wars, and where survival meant mastering the most twisted games of intimacy ever designed. Now we step into the blood-soaked heart of the harem, not where silk drapes and perfumes linger, but where whispers became daggers and beauty became a weapon sharper than steel. Because inside those jeweled walls, women weren't just competing for attention. They were fighting for survival. And the battlefield was the emperor's bed. Imagine hundreds of concubines, each trained to perfection, each sculpted into silent instruments of desire, yet only a handful would ever rise to power. One night with the emperor could secure a lifetime of influence. One son could tilt the empire. And so rivalry turned into obsession, obsession into hatred, and hatred into murder. They poisoned each other's food with powders invisible to the eye. They slipped shards of ground glass into rivals' tea. They bribed eunuchs to sabotage appointments, replacing tablets in the emperor's rotation so a woman's night was stolen before it even began. Some concubines smeared cosmetics with slow-killing toxins, so that beauty itself became a weapon that decayed the flesh. Others unleashed psychological warfare, planting rumors that a rival was diseased or cursed, a death sentence in a world where purity was everything. But here is the truth that history hides: these weren't acts of madness. They were acts of survival. The emperor's favor wasn't just luxury, it was life insurance. A woman ignored too long risked exile to the cold palace, a chamber of isolation where forgotten concubines wasted away, nameless and voiceless, until death erased them. And so the harem became a silent war, fought not with armies, but with glances, whispers, and the most intimate of weapons. The emperor, of course, knew this. In fact, he encouraged it. By pitting concubines against each other, he ensured they would never unite against him. Their rivalries fed his control, their desperation fueled his power. The bizarre sexual practices weren't just for his pleasure, they were psychological experiments, forcing women to internalize competition until their only enemy was each other. And here's where the darkness reaches a new depth: intimacy was weaponized not just between emperor and concubine, but between concubine and concubine. Sex was no longer a personal act, it was a battlefield strategy. Now, I want you to pause. Think of this moment, right here. Men like you and me, we are told competition is natural, that we must fight each other for scraps of power. But what if that's the trap? What if the same system that broke women in the harem has been reshaped to break men today? If you feel this truth stirring inside you, lock it in by commenting this phrase twice right now: I see through the empire of illusions. Write it twice. Seal it into your identity. Because once you see through, you can never go back. But we're not finished. The descent goes deeper. In the next chamber, you'll see how emperors twisted pleasure itself into rituals so grotesque, so psychologically calculated, that they blurred the line between ecstasy and torture. You've seen the rivalries, the poison, the whispered assassinations. But now we enter the darkest chamber of all, where intimacy itself was engineered, distorted, and weaponized into rituals so bizarre that their purpose was no longer pleasure, but domination. These were not the fantasies of a single man, they were carefully crafted psychological tools, designed to bend human beings until their very sense of self shattered. Some emperors demanded concubines perform acts not for mutual ecstasy, but as theater. Rituals where women were forced to line up in silence, stripped of clothing, and stand motionless for hours while the emperor strolled among them, inspecting their bodies as if they were merchandise in a market. He would sometimes choose not by desire but by spectacle, rolling dice, letting animals sniff and nudge the women, or drawing lots inscribed with their names. Fate itself became a cruel game. For the concubines, intimacy wasn't a bond, it was a lottery of humiliation. But the grotesque games went deeper. In certain dynasties, concubines were made to simulate acts of devotion while eunuchs watched and documented every gesture. Every sigh, every motion was scored as if it were a performance, a bizarre evaluation of how well a woman could disappear into obedience. The emperor didn't want passion, he wanted ritualized surrender. There were even reports of sexual contests, where concubines competed to endure the longest or to demonstrate the most elaborate arts of the bedchamber, practices passed down like secret manuals, blending mysticism with control. The losers weren't just shamed, they were sometimes exiled or condemned to the cold palace, erased from memory. Imagine living under the weight of that threat, that even your intimacy was a test, a battlefield, a verdict. And yet, here is the most chilling truth. These practices were not born out of decadence alone. They were systems of power, designed to fracture identity. When a person cannot tell the difference between ritual and reality, between choice and command, between pleasure and pain, they no longer resist. They surrender. And in that surrender, the emperor held dominion not just over their bodies, but over their minds. Look closer and you'll see the mirror. These systems weren't abandoned with time. They've been reshaped, refined, and fed back into our world in new forms. Today, the rituals may not involve silk sheets or golden eunuchs, but the principle remains: break a person's will by distorting desire, and you can own their soul. But the rabbit hole doesn't end here. Because if the harem was a prison of flesh, it was also a factory of illusion, one that shaped not only women, but the empire itself. In the next descent, you'll see how the harem wasn't just about sex at all. It was about power, politics, and the manipulation of generations yet unborn. Now we reach the chamber where the masks are torn away, the place where the harem reveals its truest, coldest purpose. Because despite the silks, the perfumes, the elaborate rituals of desire, the imperial harem was never truly about sex. It was about bloodlines. It was about politics. It was about the quiet engineering of dynasties that would rule nations for centuries. Every concubine was more than a woman. She was a potential vessel of succession, a womb that could decide the future of empires. This is why every touch, every encounter, every night in the emperor's bed was documented with obsessive precision. A child born in the harem wasn't just a child. He was a weapon, a bargaining chip, a living claim to the throne. And the women knew it. That's why they poisoned rivals, why they bribed eunuchs, why they clawed their way into the emperor's rotation. They weren't just fighting for favor, they were fighting for the survival of their bloodline in the highest game of power ever played. But the manipulation ran even deeper. The emperor himself used the harem as a weapon of control, not only over the women, but over the empire. By elevating one concubine's son, he could weaken another faction of nobles. By favoring a woman from one region, he could buy loyalty from that province. The harem was a battlefield in disguise, where geography, politics, and flesh all merged into a single, invisible war. And here lies the most chilling truth: the harem was an institution of deliberate corruption. It took the most natural force in humanity, intimacy, reproduction, the bond between man and woman, and twisted it into a machine of manipulation. Love became calculation. Desire became policy. Birth itself became strategy. The women who bore sons lived under constant surveillance. Their food was tested, their steps monitored, their very breaths measured by eunuchs. Why? Because the future emperor lived inside them. And when that child was born, the harem exploded into new wars of power. A boy with imperial blood was no infant. He was a weapon. And sometimes, that weapon was silenced before it could ever grow teeth. Infants smothered. Children poisoned. Rival heirs erased from existence as if they had never been. This is the depth of control. The emperor's bed was not a place of pleasure. It was a throne room. Every sigh, every embrace, every pregnancy was a chess move in a game so vast it spanned generations. And now, you begin to see the pattern. What they built in silk and gold centuries ago still echoes in our world today, a system where intimacy is distorted into politics, where families are fractured by manipulation, where human bonds are hijacked to serve power. But there is one more descent. The final chamber. The place where you see not just what the harem was, but what it means for you now. Because the harem was never just a story of the past, it was a blueprint of control that survives in forms you've lived your entire life without recognizing. This is where the descent ends, and where the revelation begins. You've walked with me through silk-draped chambers, through poison, through rituals of humiliation, through the grotesque bureaucracy of desire. You've seen women turned into weapons, intimacy turned into policy, and bloodlines twisted into tools of empire. But if you think the harem died with the emperors, you've misunderstood everything. The harem was never just a place. It was a system. And systems evolve. Look around you now. In the modern world, intimacy is still commodified, still manipulated, still recorded and weaponized. Not by eunuchs with ledgers, but by algorithms that track every search, every swipe, every fantasy you feed into a glowing screen. Just as concubines were measured, catalogued, and judged, so too are men today, profiled, predicted, and nudged by invisible systems designed not for your freedom, but for your obedience. The emperors of the past used harems to break women, to pit them against each other so they would never unite against him. The emperors of today? They pit men against each other. They distort your desires, inflame your competition, addict you to illusions of intimacy while draining your strength, your focus, your will. The system doesn't want you free. It wants you broken, compliant, distracted, and too fractured to rise. The bizarre practices of the harem were rehearsals of psychological control. What was tested on women centuries ago has been perfected on entire populations today. You are not being inspected for your teeth and posture, you are being inspected for your attention, your habits, your loyalty. The emperor's eunuchs have been replaced by data harvesters. The cold palace has been replaced by quiet, invisible exile, irrelevance, invisibility, a life that leaves no mark. And here is the most dangerous truth: once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that what was done inside those gilded walls is now being done on a global scale, the illusions crack. You realize that power has always fed on the same principle: control the flesh, control the desire, control the mind. But you are not powerless. Men who see through the empire of illusions become immune to its chains. History is not just a story of the dead. It is a warning for the living. And now you carry it inside you. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you return to the silks and perfumes of distraction, pretending you never heard these secrets? Or will you step into the world awake, aware, and armed with knowledge that emperors never wanted you to have? Because once you've descended this far, there is no way back.